We may, if the questions start becoming very fast and furious, we might interrupt and just take audience questions in the middle for all of us. Okay, I think we've got it's 5:30 and we're going to start on time. People will join in as and how we speak, but let me begin. So we okay? Nato, Sana, Jay, James? Okay, great. Amrut. So good evening and welcome to everyone, especially to our panelists. It is appropriate that this week we are discussing the topic of China's maritime gray zone activities, because Monday, July 12th, marked the 5th anniversary of the UN Tribunal's award to the Philippines on disputes regarding the legal basis of maritime rights and entitlements in the South China Sea, an emphatic victory for the Philippines. Because despite China's promises in 2015 that it would not pursue militarization of the islands in the South China Sea and to manage differences and disputes through dialogue, negotiations, and consultations, those promises have now been broken. The 2016 Tribunal Award itself has been repeatedly declared illegal, null, and void by China. China practices overt and covert operations in the area through its navy, but also its militia and all manner of maritime gray zone activities. Consequently, the rules-based maritime order is under grave threat, and more so in the South China Sea, which is now part of the new geostrategic concept of the Indo-Pacific. The region is critical for global commerce and security and is undermined. To discuss this today, we are joined by experts from the US, the Philippines, and Taiwan to help us navigate the complex webs of Chinese maritime gray zone activities. May I please introduce James Krasker, Professor of International Maritime Law in the Stockholm Center for International Law at the US Naval War College. We have two leading experts from the Philippines, Professor J. Botang Bokal, the director of the UP Institute for Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea in Manila. He was a member of the technical team that prepared and defended the 2012 Philippines claim to a continental shelf in the Benham Rise region. Also from the Philippines is Professor Renato de Castro, a professor of Chinese Studies at the International Studies Department, De La Salle University in Manila. He served as a consultant in the National Security Council of the Philippines during the Aquino administration. And Dr. Sana Hashmi, visiting fellow at the Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation in Taipei, where she is seeing firsthand the many dimensions of Chinese gray zone warfare. Before we begin the discussion, I will ask Peter Ramel, who heads KAS, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in India, to say a few words and deliver the opening remarks. Peter?
Thank you, Manjeet. Esteemed panelists, dear Manjeet and Rajiv, friends, ladies and gentlemen, at this juncture of COVID-19, when most of the nations are trying to unite their efforts to defeat the pandemic, China once again seems to be keen to divide. A division with the Red Dragon has been carefully orchestrating over the last 2 decades. Its claim over 80% of the South Asian Sea as its, let's call it, private bathtub. In the past, China's strategy in the South China Sea had tended to be more akin to the spirit of the ancient Chinese general and philosopher Sun Tzu, who famously wrote, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting." However, recently emboldened by a world distracted by the devastating COVID pandemic, China's strategy quickly intensified to critically high degrees of aggression. The Red Dragon recent brute force demonstrations in which the CCCP deployed its fishing militia, closely followed by Chinese naval forces to forcibly expel littoral states from their own exclusive economic zones, are emblematic of China's increasingly escalatory policy in the South China Sea. And I guess you all will remember the headlines some days ago when a US warship cruising through was kind of forced to change course. The man behind this strategy change appears evident. President Xi Jinping, who in his bid to consolidate his power needs to keep the growing Chinese middle class in good spirits, yet a slowing Chinese economy implies that a potent rallying cry is needed to realize Xi Jinping's aspirations. This rallying cry has been clearly reflected in the CCP's increasingly nationalist tone concerning the South China Sea. The consequences of submitting to this Chinese policy of intimidation for the rest of the liberal world are equally unambiguous as China's strategy. The Red Dragon's contemplated BATAP would not only exclude Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia from the exclusive economic zone, but with 30% of the world's shipping trade passing through it, it would effectively control any trade flow to and from the booming economic markets of Southeast Asia. So the stakes are enormously high, since Xi Jinping appears to comprehend that if China gains sole authority over what and who is allowed to sail through these waters, he will gain massive leverage in terms of foreign policy compliance. Of course, they have also assured that the international trade can get through unhindered, but as Manjit mentioned in the beginning, many things were promised and not kept. Moreover, if nations do not have access to these waters, a global trade artery worth trillions of dollars annually, it appears likely that the economies of some of these nations will inexorably be left to bleed dry. However, arguably and even more alarmingly, China's approach to the South China Sea seeks to eradicate the liberal international order that has endured since the end of the Second World War. This international order is based on commonly and democratically agreed upon laws such as United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. To replace it, China is aggressively working to impose by force an alternative regime of governance in this vital waterway. The so-called Nine-Dash Line, based on Beijing's continental conception of maritime sovereignty, a conception which is based on dubious historical claims stemming back as far as to the 15th century, as well as under unclear and disproportionate demarcations that would secure China the exclusive sovereignty over the lion's share of South China Sea. UNCLOS and has clear regulations. Islands are part of it, rocks are not. So it missed, and the court dismissed the claims, but China refuses to recognize the judgment in spite of having signed and ratified the treaty, thus behaving like a rose nation in the international set framework. One thing is clear, the international community must stand strong and united against this Chinese expansionist policy, which tramples all over democratic principles such as the rule of law before it is too late. But ladies and gentlemen, let me assure you that China's success is forcefully claiming territory in the South China Sea. So far, it's by no means final. The challenges posed by the CCCP's revisionist notion of maritime sovereignty, where maritime areas can be claimed as blue national soil, will necessitate finely tuned economic and diplomatic pressure, as well as military deterrence, all in a tandem, and that leads to the word cooperation. This entails that the US should strive towards matching diplomatic condemnation by all nations in the South China Sea, including the other Quad members, Japan, India, and Australia. On the military side, more freedom of navigation patrols will be required not only by the US, but also by other allies, including leading NATO nations like France being very present, Germany starting to send a ship there. Finally, part of this confrontation will take place in the cyber world, and strong defenses will be needed here as China is likely to use this avenue to make its grievances felt. Let me conclude, ladies and gentlemen. I want to emphasize that it must be clear to all of us that China's self-mandating of the law of the sea is one of the greatest threats of our day and age. If you do not oppose it, the erosion of the credibility of our internationally recognized rule of law system will become inevitably, and the repercussions will reverberate beyond the region of South China Sea. And we notice the same concept being applied in the Himalayas, be it Bhutan or parts of India, where the salami strategy is used to test how far there is resistance and how the gray zone activities can be changed into fait-accompli for the benefit of China's expansionism. Indeed, international law would be replaced by the law of the strongest, which instead of leading us forward would plunge us back into dark ages where human rights were merely abstract concepts and a state sovereignty depended on its military might to protect it. As John Eliasson has once said, there can be no peace without development, no development without peace, and no lasting peace or sustainable development without respect for human rights and the rule of law. So creating a better world requires teamwork, partnerships, and collaboration of the like-minded. And so, friends, as I already mentioned before, let us work together to bring lasting peace and justice to a world that has been severely traumatized already for a considerable stretch of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. These are grave words, and we certainly have with us today a group of the like-minded on this panel discussion. Dear audience, we request you all to mute your systems, and also, if you like, you can send in your questions on the chat box, and I will moderate it at the end of the session. We will have about a 40-minute conversation. I will be in conversation with the panelists, and they will also converse with each other, after which we will have Q&A. So I'm going to start right away. I'm going to start with you, James. James, the US Special Operations Command defines gray zone challenges as competitive interactions among and within state and non-state actors that fall between the traditional war and peace duality. What drives Chinese maritime gray zone activities, and what international laws do they challenge?
Thank you very much, Manjeet, and thank you also to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and to the Gateway House for the kind invitation to participate, and also Chancellor Rimmel, thank you very much for your comments earlier, and Ambassador Bhatia, pleasure to join with you as well today. So the question, I think, is actually quite easy. This concept of the gray zone tends to have created some amount of disorientation or confusion among states that have confronted it, not just, of course, in the West, and not even principally in the West, because you have other states in Southeast Asia, as well as India and South Asia and Japan, that are more on the forefront of China's gray zone activities. The gray zone is supposed to be this area that lies between peacetime and wartime, and this is a classic understanding of public international law. But I would suggest that, at least from a legal standpoint, and maybe even a political and military standpoint, that we dissuade ourselves from a gray zone. There is no legal gray zone. Something is either peacetime activity or it occurs during armed conflict, and it's subject to the law of armed conflict. And of course, in the law of armed conflict, that allows status-based targeting. So one country can kill lawfully another country's persons or strike their warships or their aircraft during the law of armed conflict. We're not in an armed conflict. We're in peacetime. So why do we call China's aggression gray zone? There's two reasons. Because collectively, and we're all responsible, and all of our governments have failed to respond to China's coercion, because we lack both the will, the political will, and sometimes the capability. And in this respect, I would suggest that there are some countries that lack the capability, such as often the Philippines. But there are others that have the capability but don't have the political will, such as the United States or Japan. And so there are a lot of tools or mechanisms, if I could look at just the United States or maybe European Union states and NATO, as well as Japan, Australia, possibly India sometimes. There are a lot of tools in the toolkit that we have not even begun to use, because we have not had the political will within our systems. For example, in cyber attacks, there's lots of things that the United States and other countries could do against cyber election interference in the US, in Australia, and around the world, really, by Chinese state-sponsored hackers. In international trade, of course, there is a trade imbalance, say, between the Philippines and China, but there's not between China and the United States. The United States actually is much less affected or dependent on China's economy as China's economy is on the US. And so there are certainly lots of tools that the United States, even the Trump administration, never brought to bear. I'll give you just one example in the interest of time, not even related to trade, that could happen tomorrow. Chinese Communist Party princelings spend their parents' money to go to Ivy League schools in the United States, cut all their visas off. China, there's more Chinese students in American schools than from any other country by far, any other of these foreign international students. Cut their visas off. There's no reason that you can't use something like that as a lever. There's many, many other examples, of course. In conclusion, what I would say is that our efforts to help China in the late 1990s collectively were somewhat laudable. We believed that, and it was a bipartisan failure in the United States, we believed that if we helped China and gave them numerous exceptions to the rules-based order, that they would become more like us. And we know, of course, that that was a colossal failure, and that the stronger that China has gotten, the worse it has gotten, and the less like us it has become. And so that's where I would suggest, when we look at the gray zone, is we examine our own willpower and our own individual and collective capabilities to be able to push back. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk.
Thank you, James. Renato, I'm going to come to you. The 2016 UN Arbitral Tribunal Award set a legal standard and precedent for countering the Chinese maritime gray zone activities. Despite the success, why have other claimant states like Vietnam and Brunei, also in the South China Sea, not taken China to the UN? And what can give the Duterte administration greater strategic maneuverability to enforce its own UN award and counter Chinese activities?
Okay, let me address the two questions. About Vietnam,
Yes.
you have disputes between China and Vietnam, but they're both communist countries.
Yes.
So Vietnam doesn't want to cross the red line. So if there's a crisis between Vietnam and China, it's resolved to the party level. So this is a calculation. Vietnam is still a communist country. From both countries' perspective, they're still ruled by fraternal parties. This is what I heard about Brunei, and I don't have any evidence whatsoever, but I heard it from the Malaysians. Brunei cut a deal with China in terms of, do you remember this? Around 2009, 2010, the price of oil went down. So there was supposed to be a deal. This is coming from the Malaysians. Yeah, you know, take it with a grain of salt, knowing how the Malaysians deal with the Bruneians. They're not the best of friends in this world. So there's supposed to be, Brunei will keep quiet about the South China Sea issue if China would purchase Bruneian oil at the friendship price. Take it with a grain of salt. It came from the Malaysians. Now, regarding President Duterte, how would he use this as a leverage? You have to remember what he did in 2016 when the ruling came out. Basically, he dropped the ruling like a hot potato and cut a deal with China. So how can you expect that person who's bent on appeasing China to use the ruling as a leverage? He was not very happy when the ruling came out in 2016. Many Filipinos were very happy, except the government. So in fact, he used the ruling as a leverage so he could extract, funding for his build program. So he only acknowledged the ruling last year in September. But this year, during the Winston Shoal standoff between the Philippines and China, he even had the guts to basically take the Chinese position that the ruling is just a piece of trash paper. So how can you expect a president or an administration that is bent on appeasing China in using the ruling as a leverage against its patron state, China? So probably we will have to watch for the next election next year. And hopefully we will have a president that is very conscious and will take into account, the interests of the country, which is of course to challenge China's expansive claim in the South China Sea, and not to appease China, not to announce to the world that he loves Xi Jinping. And he even announced in front of the Chinese ambassador in January 2018 that he wants the Philippines to be a province of China. So the next year election will be a very crucial election. This is part of our task as academics to tell the Filipino people that foreign policy issue is an important election issue. And for, of course, the members of the Quad, the United States and Japan, India and Australia and other like-minded countries to watch the Philippine election next year.
We will surely do that. And the Philippines is becoming even more important now in our region. Jay, a question for you. What do ASEAN countries expect from the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea? And a small follow-up, what about protecting the interests of other countries, including India, which use the South China Sea?
Yes, thank you. Thank you to the Detail House and to Konrad and Stiftung for inviting me to this webinar. Well, the question with respect to what ASEAN wants out of the Code of Conduct, clearly ASEAN's interest as a whole is to, number one, maintain its centrality. Well, it's struggling to maintain that given the geopolitical forces that are competing within the region. It's not doing very well in that regard, no? And second, it wants to ensure that the region remains peaceful and stable because they do not want it to again become an arena for geopolitical conflict. And I think that is what drives most of the Southeast Asian nations in their decisions. Now, there is a complication, however, that some ASEAN members are in a way much more aligned with China and Chinese interests by force of circumstance. A number of them are really utterly dependent on their trade relations, economic relations with China. And because of that, they aren't really, they're quite prone rather to taking the Chinese position on these issues. And that prevents ASEAN from maintaining its centrality and influence over the South China Sea disputes. And that's why it has been rather weak in its attempt to put together this framework, this code of conduct, which was originally intended as a means to manage the disputes, address and prevent the crisis from emerging and escalating, and hopefully also point the way to the eventual settlement, peaceful settlement of these complicated disputes. Unfortunately, because of the way things have been going and the expanding power of China and its influence over some ASEAN members, and the inability of ASEAN really to come to a consensus on even something as simple as what really are their common interests when it comes to the South China Sea. Because of that, they haven't really been able to progress as much. The COC negotiations that are ongoing, in a way, is emblematic of that struggle and that problem. It's been decades. They've been negotiating this code of conduct really essentially since 1996, when the first declaration of conduct was signed, and it was intended to evolve into a more robust code of conduct. But despite the passage of those decades, there has practically been very little progress. On the current negotiations, while the ASEAN has been able to produce a single draft negotiating text, which is actually essentially a collection of proposed texts that the different countries wanted to see in the final document. The fact is, with 11 countries making contributions of texts, they've ended up with a rather lengthy and complex document that they have not yet even reached a substantial phase as of this time. The pandemic really delayed progress on the code of conduct negotiations. At best, they were able to put together a document that they agreed would be what they will talk about. And then in the meantime, they also added, some countries also added additional provisions which caused even more controversy or debate among the 11 countries that are negotiating this. And it was at that point that the pandemic set in. So because of the pandemic, they were unable to meet. And when they resume, and well, they hope to be able to resume later this year or next year at least, they will practically be just starting to organize that substantive discussion. So with respect to these issues that you ask, like what are the, is there any protection for legitimate third-party interests in this framework of this negotiation? Actually, it's still on the table, because while there were provisions that were suggested by China, for example, China wanted external non-ASEAN countries to not be participating in the economic activities in the South China Sea, for example, or they proposed that all the countries would essentially have a veto power against the other members undertaking joint exercises with their treaty allies or security partnerships. So these kinds of proposals indicate really an attempt to exclude third parties or non-ASEAN, non-China parties from the economic and political events of the region. But it's only reached a stage of proposed text, no? As I mentioned, the substantive discussions have not yet even started. Although the sense of the people I've spoken with point to these kinds of proposals not really being acceptable, still we have to wait until they actually go through the process of substantive discussions before we see exactly what it is, what kind of arrangements it is that they will come up with in order to address third-party interests. The mere mention of the role of third parties in the COC itself is a controversial issue as far as I know, because it is one of those new, it's involved in one of those new proposals that was made, no? And so they've still also yet to really discuss and finally decide on precisely what role third parties will have vis-a-vis the document, like whether they will be asked to, or whether they will be invited to accede to it, similar to what happened with the Declaration of Conduct, or will they be also asked to be signatories, or whether they will be actual participants. Those questions are not yet settled at this point, and they have yet to be debated by the ASEAN and China. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Sana, you are sitting in Taiwan, which is on the front line of Chinese multi-domain gray zone activities. Maritime, air, defense, cyber, psychological warfare, it's all there. So the country's recent quadrennial defense review now has a whole chapter dedicated to gray zone activities by China. Can you tell us more about the maritime challenges faced by Taiwan and how it plans to counter them?
Thank you for the kind introduction, Chair, and thank you for inviting me to speak in this webinar. It's my pleasure to speak alongside such distinguished speakers. So at the outset, I would like to say that though China's gray zone warfare tactics have intensified in the recent past, this is not something that is new for Taiwan. Taiwan has been a victim of China's aggressive postures for a very long time now, and this is actually a perennial threat for Taiwan. But now the level and intensity of such activities have certainly increased. And this is primarily because first, of course, China under Xi Jinping is a different China now. The world is facing a more assertive and aggressive China. So the very fact that we four speakers are discussing China's gray zone warfare tactics in different areas is a visible sign how China has launched gray zone warfare tactics at several fronts at the same time. So I think it's a very important topic that we are discussing today, not only for Taiwan, but other countries as well. But when we talk about Taiwan, of course, the intensity has been increased. And one of the latest development was on June 15, as many as 28 military aircraft encroached into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. So this was the highest reported for in a single day for Taiwan. So we have to see the timings of such activities. So that was just 2 days after G7 issued a statement on Taiwan. So this was clearly a move to intimidate Taiwan, as also to issue a warning to the countries to stay away from mentioning or even discussing Taiwan. So basically what Taiwan has been facing is China's continuous aggression towards Taiwan. So I think it's also worthy to note why China has been intensifying its tactics towards Taiwan. The first reason is to consolidate its claim on Taiwan that China had never controlled. Second is to keep Taiwan preoccupied so that its external engagement and international outreach remains limited. And then its resources are depleted fast, given there's huge asymmetry between China and Taiwan's military capabilities. The third is, of course, as I've said, to intimidate Taiwan. And under DPP, led by a resilient leader, President Tsai Ing-wen, Taiwan has become much more confident than ever before. Then last year was a unique year for Taiwan, as it got immense attention and support from countries across the world. Now with several countries facing similar challenges in the face of China's aggression, and it's actually a destabilizing factor for a lot of countries in the Indo-Pacific region. So more countries are realizing how important it is to speak up for Taiwan, to talk about Taiwan. So this unprecedented support has also kind of made China more insecure vis-a-vis Taiwan. Even though Taiwan is discussed more and has got more support and attention now, the China threat still looms large over Taiwan's security, and it's a formidable challenge for its armed forces. So to answer your question, what has been Taiwan's response to this? So the stated policy is, of course, not to provocate Taiwan. Taiwan shouldn't really trigger China, and in all circumstances, it should avoid a conflict with China. However, no matter what Taiwan responds, how it responds to it, there will be no cutting back on the gray zone warfare tactic by China. So Taiwan is working towards consolidating its defense strategy. It is very well aware of the presence of asymmetry between China and Taiwan, and that it is impossible to actually match up with China and present a credible deterrence on its own. So to give you an example, where Taiwan is spending just $15 billion as its defense budget this year, China is spending more than $200 billion. So we could actually make sense of how huge the difference is. And Taiwan has just 2 modern attack submarines, whereas China has 50 modern attack submarines than Taiwan. So keeping that in mind, Taiwan introduced its overall defense concept. So Taiwan's response is more about survival, and countering China's gray zone activities is a part of that. So the focus is very well on defending itself against any potential attack and only strike back when China escalates. So apart from this, it is also maintaining robust defense ties with the US. Consistent arms sale is a part of the strategy to prepare Taiwan for self-defense. But I think apart from these conventional activities that Taiwan has been doing, it's very important for Taiwan to also work towards building its capabilities, of course, and along with that, a dialogue with regional countries is immensely important. This is why it is critical for Taiwan to actively participate in a dialogue with the like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you, Sana. That was very interesting. You know, China has more of everything, more than anybody else does. So I'm going to come to you, James, but some of what you were saying about how we should respond, I think we all remember the Fisheries Minister of Indonesia, Susi Pujastuti, who, when the Chinese trawlers came near her region, used to call the Coast Guard, get into the helicopter, the Coast Guard would get down the helicopter and just take in all the Chinese fishermen and then blow up the boats. And after a while, the Chinese just stopped coming there. So maybe you need to talk to China the way China talks to you. James, what are the challenges that you foresee in the Western Pacific emerging from a possible maritime collusion between Russia and China? And what can the US do to reassure allies, partners, and regional powers of its on-the-water containment to take on China? So these are 2 separate things, but kind of related. So Russia, China, and then... US being able to reassure us. Yeah.
Yeah. So on Russia and China, it's not really an immediate concern. In fact, I have a different view, which is that eventually, I think that Russia is a natural ally to balance China, because China is so large. If you look at the disparity of power in East Asia, it's much different than in Europe. In Europe, if you count the top four actually, NATO allied states, they outnumber Russia in population and economics by about 10 to 1, including the French and British that have an independent nuclear deterrent. That score is flipped in East Asia, where even when you add in Japan, Australia, India, if you compare, not population because of India, but if you compare economics and military spending, China outspends all of those countries combined. And so I think that Russia has some reason to be a little wary of China, and I'm not sure that there would be that level or that deep of a partnership. If it happens, then that gets to your second question, which is how the U.S. can reassure. I think that if it happens, what will occur will just accelerate the present trend, which is that states are beginning to line up together in order to balance China, or if it happens, China and Russia. I'd like to see 10 years down the line that Russia is actually on the other side of the equation and a little more wary of China. I think that that's the natural order, and you have these personalities. May not turn out that way. If indeed Russia and China are in some type of greater collusion in East Asia or Asia in general, then that is even more reason for states to work together, in my view. So what can the United States do? You mentioned when you were speaking a moment ago that China outweighs all these other states, but not really. It doesn't outweigh the United States, at least yet, and it may not ever, actually. China may actually slow down before it overtakes the US in terms of economy or in terms of technology or military power. Certainly the United States hasn't been the best in this regard in protecting its position. So what can the United States do to reassure allies? It can help itself. It can be more proactive in this so-called gray zone by using the tools that it has, the trade tools, the cyber tools. Why, for example, is the Chinese Communist Party more popular than your government and my government? Well, part of the reason is because our governments continually, for democracies, and that's great, but we continually suffer relentless cyber attacks by China and Russia. Why aren't we doing the same thing to China? Why aren't we taking down their firewall? Why aren't we putting Taiwanese and independent Hong Kong and Western media into Chinese computers? All of these things that we can do under present international law or through legal countermeasures under the law of state responsibility to impose costs on China to induce compliance. So I'll stop there, but I think that there's a lot of things that we can do that would be able to effectively push back that we're not doing.
Okay, that's terrific. Renato, more non-resident powers like France, UK, well, France actually has a stake, but UK, Australia, Germany, Canada, Netherlands, etc., are also sending their warships into the South China Sea. How do ASEAN nations view the increasing deployments by non-resident powers? And what is ASEAN's maritime security strategy?
Number one, there's no ASEAN maritime security policy. ASEAN is very much allergic when you talk about security issues. In fact, my take is ASEAN is divided. Jay already mentioned it. You know, in basically three parts. You know, the three countries that could challenge China: Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. Then, of course, you have the fence-sitters there: Brunei, Singapore, Thailand, so forth. And of course, you have the continental pro-Chinese countries: Cambodia, Myanmar, Burma, then Laos. So no way could ASEAN become an alliance. It's not an alliance. Never expect it to be an alliance. against China, much more an anti-China alliance. Well, what's the view of ASEAN? Jay already mentioned it. As much as possible, the ASEAN countries are aware that if push comes to shove, the conflict will be in their backyard. They don't want to be a battleground. The same way as you remember going back to 1939 Europe, when you look at the Benelux country, look at Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands. They knew a war was coming, but they refused to take sides. That's the case of ASEAN right now. So don't expect ASEAN to be nice to the Quad. ASEAN is generally suspicious of the quadrilateral security dialogue. And there's still, we talk about, I'm very much aware of the fact that the COC would not lead to anything, but for ASEAN, that's the only way that hopefully they could have a veto over Chinese expansion into the South China Sea. So that's the case of ASEAN. And this is, of course, reflected in the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which basically ignored the ongoing geostrategic competition in the region, still asserting ASEAN centrality despite the fact that you already have the dragons, the eagles, and the elephants, and of course the sun starting to position themselves, and it will also include the kangaroo. And in this geopolitical charade that's going on in the region, that's being ignored by ASEAN. Okay, for ASEAN, the inevitable is unthinkable.
That's a good way of putting it. The inevitable is unthinkable. Okay. Jay, and to you, why is China's new Coast Guard law seen as a regional threat? I know we're coming back to things, but we'd really like your view on that.
Yes. Well, China's Coast Guard law, even though generally all countries, of course, with maritime zones and with law enforcement, maritime law enforcement units can have a law to govern the structure and operations of that unit. Even though all countries have that right, still the problem with China's Coast Guard law is that in our experience, in the past few years especially, China has not hesitated to use its laws in areas that are beyond its own lawful and legitimate jurisdiction, in areas that it claims to be its own, particularly here in the South China Sea. We have we've documented quite a number of instances where the China Coast Guard basically carried out law enforcement operations against Philippine vessels in the Philippine EEZ. And that's only because China claims that area to be its own jurisdiction as well. So you have the China Coast Guard law becoming a legal instrument by which China is able to assert its excessive and expansive claims. And that's just with respect to the issue of the area of application of this law. It's excessive application. There are also some very problematic provisions in that law which are not exactly parallel with other Coast Guard laws elsewhere in the world. So, for example, there are a number of provisions there that expressly authorize the use of force or through measures such as forced eviction, forced removal, and other forceful measures, which are not really expressly provided for in legislations of other countries, but are present here. The problem, again, is that if you correlate that provision of forceful eviction, forceful demolition of structures, for example, if you correlate that with the excessive area of application that they have been known to use it in, then it poses a danger, a clear danger against the smaller countries' vessels and structures in the South China Sea in areas which are claimed by China, even though those structures and vessels might actually be well within the exclusive economic zone and continental shelves of the smaller Southeast Asian countries. And there is also there are other problems raised, such as the authorization for China to use force extends even to measures against the government vessels of other countries. This clearly is contrary to the principles in international law of sovereign immunity of vessels that are part of your, say, Navy or your government in non-commercial service. And yet China has authorized its Coast Guard to assert itself against sovereign immune vessels of other countries. So there really are, in a way, excessive provisions embedded in this law, which could be the basis for incidents occurring within the jurisdictions, what should be the lawful jurisdictions of the surrounding smaller Southeast Asian countries. And that's why I think it really should be viewed as a threat if China persists in attempting to apply its law, its jurisdiction through law enforcement in areas beyond what it is lawfully and legitimately allowed to claim under UNCLOS. So if they stick to their own waters within 200 nautical miles of their coastline, that's fine. That's fine, perhaps, no, for a greater part of the law. But if they try to do that in the EEZs of the surrounding Southeast Asian states, then that could even, that could plausibly establish a ground for saying that China is actually engaging in aggression against these other countries. And probably the more problematic provisions, such as the authorization to act against sovereign immune vessels, and there's also another provision which authorizes them to essentially restrict the right of innocent passage of vessels, or even their freedom of navigation in areas, in waters that are claimed by China to be under its jurisdiction. No? Those will still remain even if they were to stick to only their own EEZ and continental shelf. So it's because of these problematic provisions that pose or give the basis for excessive exercises of jurisdiction. That's why I think it is regarded as a threat to regional peace and security at this time.
Okay, thank you very much. Sana, I'm going to come to you in a second, but James, would you like to weigh in on this? Or should I circle back to you? Yeah,
I'll defer to Sana.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sana, a question closer to home, and then we'll come back to James. Will the instability in the Indo-Pacific region spill over into the Indian Ocean, and how should India prepare for it?
I think India's stakes in the Indian Ocean region have been always high, and China's increasing footprint in the Indian Ocean region has been a cause of concern for India. And China has aspirations to emerge as a formidable maritime power. And Xi Jinping has confirmed this at several occasions, and Maritime Silk Road is a part of such objectives. And in fact, at the 18th and 19th Party Congress, she stated that the official policy has been to turn China into a global maritime power. So then its assertive policies in the South China Sea, East China Sea, and the wider Indian Ocean also signal towards that. So India has always been active in the Indian Ocean region to safeguard its interests. It has become all the more vigilant in its approach in the recent past. So at the civil diplomatic level, Ministry of External Affairs has this Indian Ocean region division, which is there to facilitate relations with the Indian Ocean countries in a coordinated fashion. Then in 2019, Indian Ocean division was expanded to include the islands of the African coast as well. Then AME also has Indo-Pacific division so the Indo-Pacific and the Indian Ocean division, they work in tandem. Then India also conducts Indian Ocean dialogues such as IORA and Indian Ocean Naval Symposium. So the institutional mechanisms also exist for better coordination, and to protect its interest, India also introduced initiatives such as Saga, Project Mosam, and recently Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. And India also sent a concept note to countries such as Australia, Philippines, and Vietnam. So India has been taking initiatives, and then India is also working towards the overall development of the blue economy. Then apart from all these things within the Indo-Pacific framework, India is also cooperating with countries such as, of course, the Quad countries, and also with France. Then India's invitation to Australia for Malabar was also a part of its changed approach and have a multilateral solution to China's assertive approach. And within the Indo-Pacific, India is also looking for trilateral mechanisms. India already has a trilateral with Australia and Indonesia. Then we just saw a meeting of Australia, India, France trilateral. Then India has 2+2 with Japan and the US. So to conclude, I would say that the change approach is that there is a realization that China's increasing footprint is a common concern. It's a shared concern. So a joint approach is needed to counter China's aggressive postures in the Indian Ocean region.
And so now we have a question from the audience related to this from Alok Palsikar. Won't the Chinese presence in Sri Lanka through its port initiative help them in increasing its influence in the Indian Ocean?
This is a part of, this is a concern for India because Sri Lanka, of course, being a very important part of the Indian Ocean region, is also in India's neighborhood. So it directly impinges upon India's neighborhood policy as well. But I think when we talk about all these countries like Sri Lanka and all these small countries that are important part of the Belt and Road Initiative, you also have to look at how they're approaching India and other countries as well. Of course, we have this example of Hambantota Port, but then we can't really overlook this fact that India and Japan also kind of cooperating with Sri Lanka to develop the deep port. So I think more than Sri Lanka, and more than about, it's not about these countries, more about countries such as India and Japan, what alternative they could actually offer to these countries. And I think more than India, it is Japan that is actually leading such initiatives. We have this example of Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, and Japan has been the strongest proponent of the Indo-Pacific, of the quadrilateral dialogue, and it's actually presenting a credible alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative and its other development assistance to smaller countries.
Thanks, Sana. I'm going to get back to, can we just take a few questions from the audience apart from this one? So we have a, I think, James, you've already answered some of that, but one of the questions, and this is to you, James, from Aditya Bhan, there's reason to believe that the American deep state is attempting to improve relations with Russia, but aren't the NATO allies in Europe putting spanners in the work of this potential realignment?
Well, I would just say that there's plenty of blame to go around for all of our failure to act in the face of China. There's lots of things we could do, and the whole whether Russia is a potentially friendly country. They're obviously not friendly right now, but can they be brought over or not? That's something that would have to take time and effort, and it may fail. It may fail. Russia just may be recalcitrant, and so. That's a separate factor. I think that we have to work that angle, but there's so much more that we can already do. For example, the United States is a treaty ally of the Philippines. It's a bit of a metaphor that the Philippines has beached this derelict vessel, the BRP Sierra Madre. This vessel cannot even get underway. It was an old World War II vessel that the United States gave to the Philippines. Rather than doing that, why aren't we building new national security cutters and then approaching the Philippines and saying, hey, why don't we help you with 50-50 crews operating these cutters and produce a lot of them? China just produced last year 60,000 tons of naval vessels, 60,000 tons, actually not last year, just in a week they launched that. And so we ought to be responding with capability and responding with real engagement, have the political will to be able to work together. So I think that's the solution, more than focusing on Russia, which could turn out worse or may turn out eventually to be better.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to get back to audience questions, but while we have you here, James, what is the US Coast Guard? What kind of role does that play in countering Chinese maritime gray zone activities in the West Pacific?
Yeah, I mean, sadly, the US Coast Guard is under-resourced, vastly under-resourced. And so the problem, as I see it in the United States, is that we spent the past 20 years focused on wars that were sort of wars of election in the Middle East. And it sapped a lot of our treasure and cost an unfortunate high level of deaths and injuries. both on the US side and especially in the region, made the region less stable than when we intervened to begin with. And that has caused some amount of sea blindness on the part of the United States. And so now, politically, there's an idea that you have 1/3 money going to the Air Force and the Space Force, 1/3 of the money going to the Navy and the Marine Corps, 1/3 of the money going to the Army. And I would make a massive adjustment to that. I would have the problems that we face are not problems that can be addressed or deterred with additional Army forces. We need a very large Coast Guard and a larger Navy. And then those forces ought to be able to be force multipliers for allied forces in the region and strategic partners such as India and Vietnam.
Okay, I'm going to ask our Filipino friends the question about their opinion on the Quad. Is there a role for the Quad in respect of this maritime security? And Sana has mentioned several things that we've done. The Malabar exercises have kind of become the Quad exercise. What would you expect from the Quad? What would you like to see? If ASEAN is so weak, what can the Quad do? And let's go with you, Jay, and then we'll go to Renato.
Well, it's a bit hard to answer because for practical intents and purposes, the Quad hasn't really become that concrete yet. No, I mean, it's so far it's been an idea, and there have been signs of countries that appear to be members, potential members of the Quad, making meetings and indicating some kind of strategic intention in the direction. But I think for ASEAN, it's not yet. Yes, it's right. Still not very clear, and for observers like us as well, it's also not yet very solid, the concept, and there is not as yet no concrete manifestation really of a long-term Quad structure or alliance, or whatever you would call it. The fact that I cannot even describe it at this point is indicative of that lack of clarity. But for ASEAN, I think if the Quad is to become attractive and useful to ASEAN, it must be something that provides ASEAN with a way to diversify its economic and political relationships and the kinds of resources, whether it's in terms of trade or in terms of markets. It must provide ASEAN with options so that it can not be forced to make choices between the dominant superpowers that are competing in the region. By providing alternatives, by providing options, it would give ASEAN a little bit more maneuvering room, I think, instead of being frozen in the headlights of these two oncoming trains. It should give rather ASEAN other means of softening or loosening whatever restraints some of the dominant powers may have on them, or a means of neutralizing and playing off against the overbearing influence of one or the other. So that, I think, is what it can provide them, basically options. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And Renato, a word about the Quad and then a follow-up question, which is, you will be able to answer, why is Duterte still popular in the Philippines? And according to the polls, I think, according to the polls, his daughter Sarah is likely to win. So will she be any better? So Quad first and then Sarah.
Quad, specific to the Philippines, people are not aware about the Quad. Paradoxically, the Quad was formed twice in Manila in the back of the ASEAN summit in 2008 and again in 2017. I still remember I was asked by the Department of Foreign Affairs in 2018 to explain what's the Quad all about, because the people in the Department of Foreign Affairs noticed that the the Secretary of the Department of State, the Japanese Foreign Minister, met in a room in the Philippine Convention Center in Manila on the side of the ASEAN Summit that was held here in Manila in 2017. So that's another question. You know, what is a Quad all about? So we have to explain to them. As Jay mentioned, it offers an alternative, but of course, there's also a fear that it might be transformed into an ASEAN NATO, as how China is trying to portray Quad. Of course, when it becomes an alliance, that will be an anathema against many of the ASEAN members, because this will, of course, be equated with the containment of China, and of course, the possibility of a major conflict between the members of Quad. Quad is not just a association of liberal democracies; they're also maritime powers, and of course, they are also focused on the maritime domain. So this is the dilemma of the Filipinos, and it's also the dilemma of ASEAN countries. You know, what will be the nature of the quadrilateral security dialogue? Now, second, regarding Duterte, he is popular primarily because of his domestic policy, anti-crime, anti-drugs. But this is actually a very palliative measure, because Duterte has not addressed the main issue of where the drugs are coming from. They're coming from China. So, but he has created this image. I'm tough against drug lords, but actually he's just targeting small-time drug manufacturers and peddlers, while the big-time drug manufacturers are there in China. It's just a matter of imaging. You create this image. Of course, when it comes to the issue of, number one, the South China Sea, whether Duterte is doing enough, or issue of which countries that most Filipinos have confidence with. Of course, there's where you see the gap between the administration and the Filipino people. Based on the surveys conducted by the Social Weather Station and Pulse Asia, the Filipinos want the government to do something about the arbitral ruling. And of course, in terms of their countries that they trust, of course, they trust the United States, Japan, and Australia. China is the least trusted country. So when it comes to foreign policy, then you see the gap. But people generally look at Duterte in terms of what he's doing at the domestic realm. Now, whether his daughter would win the election is another matter, because it's still too early. I could still remember in the 2010 election, the one who got a lot of, in terms of the rating, was Noli de Castro, who was the vice president of Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo. Nobody remembers him right now. In 2016, it was the Vice President Binay. Nobody remembers Vice President Binay right now. So a lot of things will still happen from now to 2022, May 7, 2022. There are a lot of candidates who would like to run, but because they are simply afraid of the troll farms that are being funded and run by people who are very close to President Duterte.
Okay.
So expect, we're a liberal democracy, just like the United States, Japan.
Yes.
Expect for surprises. That's the nature of liberal democracies.
Thank you. We have a general question, and maybe this is from Sandhya. You think India is keen on pinging China on its one China policy, given that after ages, India wished His Holiness the Dalai Lama on his birthday openly. So one would think that India's support to Taiwan's cause, which is including, vax diplomacy, etc., would irk China. So should India now take that leap? Is it a strong position now? It's a new US ally, etc. James, maybe we can ask you and then take it around the room and answer some other questions.
I'm going to defer to Sana on that, please.
Oh, surely you could. Sana, go ahead.
Thank you. I wouldn't read too much into Prime Minister's wishing the Dalai Lama on his birthday. But, if you talk about India's approach on one China policy, India on ground, it still practices one China policy. And India was one of the first countries to acknowledge one China policy. But if you look at it, and specifically because China's unaccommodative stand on the boundary dispute, India has actually stopped mentioning one China policy in the joint statement since 2008. And in 2014, then Foreign Minister of India, late Sushma Swaraj, she also told Wang Yi that if China wants India to accept one China policy, it also has to acknowledge India's one India policy. So there has been a change, but despite that, I won't say that we should expect that India gets away from one China policy. And because the thing is, it's just not India. If you look at other countries as well, even if they're having issues with China, they aren't really touching upon one China policy. So I don't think that we should really read too much between the lines with respect to Taiwan or with respect to Tibet. But when it comes to Taiwan, I also want to mention that even while India mentioned one China policy in joint statements till 2008, Taiwan was never mentioned in the joint statement. So India has actually left a kind of room to cooperate with Taiwan. And also there is unofficial relationship and there is merit in engaging Taiwan. There has been a lot going on between India and Taiwan. There is the establishment of unofficial relationships since 1995. We have seen the relations have come a long way. And apart from security, and also I believe that there's something which is also going on the security front, which is not open to public. But I think if you look at economy, if you look at cultural ties, I think the relations have come a long way. So, and also when we talk about India-Taiwan relations, we really have to stop looking at Taiwan from China lens. And in fact, the stated policy of Taiwan has been that India's relation with Taiwan or India's relation with China should go parallel. Why should it actually impact India's relationship with Taiwan? So this has been the official policy. So even if India acknowledges one China policy, I would say that I wouldn't really read too much between the lines for that as well.
Thank you. And before we wind, yes?
May I just follow up on those?
Yes, please do.
And just to add to that, I mean, I did already in the chat, which is why I didn't want to take up too much time. But I would add that this China policy is not our religion.
Yes.
Okay, we're not married to it, and it's a policy. And this is one of the tools that we can go to China, something that they care about. China cares about a lot of things that other countries can control. And one of these is the China policy. If you notice, the Japan Deputy Foreign Minister made a gaffe last week. A gaffe is when a politician tells the truth, which is that Japan would intervene if China invaded Taiwan. Likely the United States would too. All of these things are elements of the relationship with China that we should be telling China, rather than parodying the Chinese line. We should say, look, this was a policy, but the policy, just like the cooperation with the Soviet Union during World War II, changed after World War II. This policy can also change.
Terrific. Thank you, James. And a wind-up question to everybody, and I'm going to start with our friends from the Philippines. So, Jay, let's go with you. What are the two suggestions you would have, you would make to policymakers for countering Chinese maritime gray zone activities? Just 2 points. Jay, you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, activist slogan. Expose and oppose. Those are the two things that need to be done against China's gray zone tactics. We have to expose them to the world because they work best because they are often carried out in places to which where access to information is limited, so that China can control the narrative, shape the battlefield, shall we say, before it actually gets out into the world. And by having that capability to shape the narrative, they are able to make other people think the same way they do, or view the incident in the same way that they want it to be viewed, and that's how they succeed. And then this can be neutralized, no, by treating these gray zone tactics like an insurgency. And insurgents work best when they are hidden, when they are blending in with the population, shall we say, or within society, so that they cannot be seen until it's already too late. But if they are exposed immediately when they're found, then they will find it difficult to even proceed to their next step. That's why I think that in this year, when at least the task force on the West Philippine Sea decided to immediately expose to the world the fleet that was anchored on Whitsun Reef, no, or Julian Felipe Reef as we call it, that really was a big surprise to China. That particular gray zone operation, no, using a reef as an anchorage, so that they can actually occupy it without occupying it in a way, that messed up that particular tactic, no, and by calling the attention of the world to that particular incident, they had to pull back, no, and that's why they dispersed the fleet. And had to pull it out of the Philippine EEZ for a brief period of time. No? Of course, they've come back, but then you would expect that. I mean, that's the way things. That's the way an insurgency goes. You know, the opposed part, on the other hand, is something along the lines of what one of our guests here actually put on the chat. No, this gray zone works because the gray zone exists. No, we need to erase the gray zone, limit limit the scope of the gray areas, and make it clear, black and white, what activities are and are not permissible. China is able to expose the gray zone because within the gray zone, you hesitate, countries hesitate, and they also view the incident as isolated from the rest of China's grand and broad strategy. If we are to neutralize the effect of the gray zone, we have to keep it out of the gray and make it really much clearer that it's black and white. These are not gray zone operations because they are intended to push a particular or to achieve a particular objective, no, using these subalterns or substitutes for what would normally be using, say, military forces or overt government forces. If we're able to do that, then we would be able to limit the ability of these, limit the utility of these gray zone operations. China will have to look elsewhere, no, or use more traditional methods, or at least go back to the negotiating table, go back to international law in order to pursue whatever interest it is that they are pursuing. At least it will then be in a legitimate arena, one where there's transparency, one where everyone is equal as members of the international community, using legitimate lawful means of resolving their disputes.
Thank you, Jay. Renato, two suggestions.
Okay, number one, I will agree with Jay. Expose and oppose. We have to know when China is applying a gray zone operation. You know, always take China's statement or actions with a grain of salt. And this reminds me of what happened way back in 1996, when China first applied a gray zone operation against the Philippines when they occupied Mischief Reef in 1995. And I could still remember, I was a consultant then in the Department of Foreign Affairs. The Chinese were saying, we're just building shelters for fisher folks. Of course, we know what's the status now of Mischief Reef. They just deployed a couple of fighter planes and a reconnaissance plane on Mischief Reef. So always take it. And the second is, let's borrow something from the Chinese playbook, from Sun Tzu, Art of War. Be like water. Adapt to the terrain. So if the Chinese would do it, we also have to adopt it. But of course, there's a caveat. In a way, when the Chinese apply gray zone operation, there's always the element of ruthlessness because it's being operated by the Communist Party. We're not, our countries are not run by the Communist Party. We're liberal democratic countries that, of course, have accountability to the rule of law internationally, and to our people. So this basically would limit. And of course, I'll just give you an example on, it's easier said than done, of the dilemma. Taking into account, taking at face value what Secretary Del Rosario said last Monday, that the Chinese basically funded the election of President Duterte, which has been done during the Cold War. I don't think at this point in time, the United States, Japan, India, and Australia would have the stomach for this, to intervene in the affairs of another democracy. But for the Chinese, this is part of the game plan. And this might happen again in 2022. So it's easier said than done when I say, be like water, because China is playing it differently. It's because of the fact it's being played by the Chinese Communist Party, who has.
Thank you, Renato. Sana? One or two suggestions to make to policymakers for countering Chinese maritime gray zone activities.
I think first I'll talk about Taiwan. We know that the biggest threat for Taiwan emanates from China, and Taiwan is determined to defend its sovereignty and safeguard its national interest. And China's activities have been unilateral. So I think we really have to accept that, acknowledge that first. And the Taiwanese leadership has not really been provocative, in fact, cautious while dealing with such threats from China, and is also hopeful for resuming dialogue with China so that the threat is minimized. So Taiwan is, of course, doing everything it could do to minimize the threat, but it is also important for other like-minded countries to counter China, to support Taiwan and raise their voice against China's coercion and its gray zone warfare tactics against Taiwan. So as an Indo-Pacific regional construct evolves, the need for major stakeholders to have a concerted Taiwan policy becomes much more relevant and important than ever before. And for the like-minded countries, facilitating Taiwan's participation in the region would bolster their resolve for ensuring a rules-based order. So Taiwan, which is a robust their resolve for ensuring a rules-based order. So Taiwan, which is a robust democracy, that it would actually contribute further stability to the region. And in addition, this is important because an escalation of tensions between Taiwan and China would disturb the very fabric of the Indo-Pacific region. And countries endorsing the Indo-Pacific construct and hopeful for a robust rules-based order would have repercussions if in an event of a conflict between Taiwan and China. So of course, countries talking more about Taiwan would mean that China would double down its gray zone activities vis-a-vis Taiwan in order to intimidate it further. But there's no doubt that more support for Taiwan would also mean that China would be less inclined to escalate the intensity of tensions.
So your suggestion is more support for China?
Yeah, I think it is going to work. And
for Taiwan, sorry, not China. Taiwan. Yeah.
Against China.
Yeah.
To conclude, it's a bit ambitious, but I think Taiwan could also be a part of a joint exercise, as in it should not necessarily be a traditional security exercise, but somewhat like that is to bolster capabilities to fight the non-traditional security threat. I'll give you an example like what China does.
We're going to run out of time. So I'm going to have you hold that thought for a minute, and maybe you can tell it to us later, put it on the chat.
I'll just finish this point because it's just a sentence. So China also does this within this Shanghai Cooperation Framework, the peace mission exercise. And while this multinational exercise, as stated by China and Russia, counterterrorism exercise, there's no denying that the US is a major factor here. So I think something like this could be incorporated with Taiwan within the larger framework of the Indo-Pacific region.
Okay, good. Thank you. And James. 2 points.
Yeah, just what I would say is that we continue to compound our error. Look at our error over the past 30 years. 30 years ago, the economy of India and China was about the same size, Imagine the world, how much better the world would have been if we had invested all of the exemptions for trade, all of the special dispensations that the United States, Japan, and the NATO countries afforded to China, all of the special market access, where, for example, China can register a company on the US stock exchange and not comply with the rules that apply to American companies. They get a pass, they get an exemption. Why? Because it's an effort in international social justice. Everybody wanted to make sure that China did not fail. Today, China's economy is 7 times as large as India's. 7 times as large as India's. Imagine what type of world we would have and the conversations we would have if that were reversed. We still could have brought 1 billion people out of poverty. It's just that they would have been people that are in a peaceful India, a democratic India, rather than under the Chinese Communist Party. So what I would say is, let's think about ways to eliminate or unwind these errors and begin to help other countries. For example, why aren't we focusing on India, Vietnam, Philippines, Sri Lanka for our supply chains? There's nothing magical about having to have everything made in China. This will require effort and some level of pain, but in the long run, just like an athlete training for an event, there's going to be some level of effort involved, and even something that is painful, but in the end, you'll be better off.
Thank you, James. And given that the Olympics are now going to start any minute, it's the good way to end this meeting. I'm going to now hand this over to Rajiv Bhatia to give his closing remarks, and thank you to all our panelists. Rajiv?
Thank you very much, Manjeet. This has been a real riveting dialogue, a dialogue where truly so many different disciplines have connected clearly: politics, diplomacy, law, naval warfare, merchant naval activities, and much more have been properly projected here. The intention in 3 minutes is not to present a summary, but to highlight some of the key points which left a very clear impression on an informed and keen listener here. Right in the beginning, the first two speakers set the tone by pointing out that the concept of gray zone activities, which comes from the duality of peace and warfare, has nothing to do with law. And it was asserted very clearly right in the beginning that there is no such thing as legal gray zone. Still, even in terms of international law, there is either something that is forbidden or illegal, or it is legal. And the more we use the term gray zone, we actually are in a way helping the biggest threat to the international peace, as Peter Rimmel put it, which is China. So essentially the focus was only on one country's, somewhat dubious, quite manifestly illegal activities. But by calling them gray zone, we probably are providing just a veneer of acceptability, which is really not the intention of any of us. My second essential key takeaway is that we have examined it from the viewpoint of multiple parties here in quite some depth. I think it was only proper that we looked at the whole thing from the ASEAN point of view. And it was made very clear that ASEAN, which is at the hot periphery of China, sees itself as a possible battleground between the US and China, or the two camps led by them. And that explains its reticence, that explains its inability to exert its centrality, and that also is partly behind the interminable delay in terms of transforming the DOC into COC. What struck me clearly was that the responsibility of China in terms of delaying the negotiations for the past 2 decades probably was implied, but was not perhaps fully projected, maybe because of the lack of time. The other parties, I think Russia kept figuring in, and it was very interesting that while we are fully aware of the strategic need to wean Russia away from China, the possibility was left open that in a few years' time, Russia could be still on China's side, or it could actually move over onto the other side as well. Naturally, Taiwan figured very promptly. That was the next point. And the power asymmetry was brought out very diligently, and yet it was pointed out that Taiwan's military strategy continues to be refined and designed in order to suit its national interests. It was also very interesting to me to hear about the ASEAN perceptions with regard to the Quad, specifically the Filipino perceptions, considering that it was actually born in their backyard. The essential point here is that all these multiple views that Quad is a partnership of democracies, or it is perceived to be an Asian NATO and so on. But the fact is that Quad has come into the psyche of the strategic thinkers of the region. I think this is a major gain, and we will have to really use the help of some of the scholars today to explore the idea of Quad further, but that would be for some other day. Last two takeaways very quickly, came out again right in the beginning when James pointed out that it is all about the countries opposing China. It is about their wills and capabilities. Is there political will? Clearly, that is debatable. Are there capabilities? Yes, there are, but not in every country, not in every corner of the Indo-Pacific. And therefore, the challenge for policymakers is to link the political will, the capabilities, or let us put it differently, to use political will to enhance the capabilities, not merely in the maritime zone, but also in terms of technological and economic capabilities, a domain on which Gateway House has been working steadily and quite quietly, and eventually the world will hear about it. The last point is about the options. So China is guilty of these activities. People are suffering, the countries are excited and agitated about it. The question is, what are the options? This was discussed in depth. In long term, frankly, it is, to my mind, subjugation, confrontation, or negotiation leading to partnerships and peace and prosperity in the region. Subjugation is something I'm sure ASEAN would not like to choose. Confrontation, nobody wants. Confrontation leading to a third world war, nobody wants. And therefore, logically, it is the third option. And that is where the panelists very astutely pointed out, agreeing with each other, that the two central options available to the powers opposed to China is to expose and to oppose. And they detailed the whole thing very well. So finally, I only can say that the panelists have done a fantastic job. The opening remarks set the tone. Thank you, Peter Rimmel. Thank you, all the panelists. And I must thank Manjeet, you, because you came up with much research and very provocative questions. And I very much hope that our audience enjoyed this extraordinary session.
Thank you. Big thank you to Amrut as well. So thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you again on our screens and hopefully in person. So thank you and good evening, and thank you for staying late.
Namaste.
Namaskar.
Thank you. Namaste. Thank you very much, dear Filipino friends. James, Sana, Amrut, a big thank you.
Yeah, we really,
James.
we're going to